I am president and co-founder of FRAXA Research Foundation. And FRAXA's mission is to find treatments and ultimately a cure for Fragile X syndrome. So this is my son, Andy, and one of his favorite friends, Aurora the horse. When Andy was born back in 1989, he had many issues that we didn't understand. And basically it took 2 years, more than 2 years, for him to get a diagnosis of Fragile X syndrome. And this is something that back in the, at that time, people hardly had heard of Fragile X. They didn't understand that it was a single gene that caused Fragile X. So right when Andy was diagnosed, the science basically exploded on Fragile X syndrome. And the gene was identified through the Human Genome Project. The protein was cloned, and we understood that our little baby was basically missing a single protein, and all of his developmental delays, his issues, were because of this very simple cause. At the same time, we, of course, like everybody else, like Allison, we went on the internet. Well, actually, there wasn't much of an internet back then, but Mike, my husband, who's a physician, went to the medical school library, found what we could on Fragile X, and the prognosis was terrifying. The pictures of 40 and 50 and 60-year-old men with Fragile X did not look good. And so basically, I wasn't a scientist, but Mike and I both knew that we had to do something, because the future that was in line for Andy was simply not something that we could live with. And so we pretty much just got started. So FRAXA Research Foundation was founded in '94 by Mike and I and another parent. And the vision of FRAXA, which wasn't accepted at the time, is that this cause of intellectual impairment and autism is potentially treatable or curable. And at the time, the idea that your intellect was something that was based on a medical and treatable problem wasn't accepted among families, wasn't accepted except among a few scientists. Another part of our vision is that here we have Fragile X with this simple cause, and we have a door to understanding autism and other developmental disorders because we can use this as a model. And so we assembled other parents. Over the years, we collected staff and a really great set of board members who are all personally impacted by Fragile X. I think this is key because it's been almost 30 years now, and we have always had our singular focus on finding treatments for Fragile X. So just looking forward, we've funded $32 million in research grants and fellowships. And that's been our biggest budget item. We basically have raised a bit more than that, but we spend over 75 or 80% of what we raise on research. Over the years, what we've needed to fund has, of course, changed. And we knew, 30 million was a lot for us. It's not a lot in the scheme of things. So we always focused on whatever the bottleneck was at the time. In early days, there was no mouse model being shared. So that was the first job. Going forward, we've understood a lot about Fragile X, about the defect, about the treatment targets we have to work with. and about outcome measures for clinical trials. So we've moved along the whole pathway with the help of many, many research teams at universities, many, many biopharma partners. And we're just really, really excited about where things are going. Since it's been so long, when we started, I remember the first conference that Mike and I went to a couple of weeks after Andy was diagnosed. And the world's experts on Fragile X gathered for this conference. And as I remember, there were five scientists working on research that might lead to understanding and ultimately treating Fragile X. So our first thought was that we could increase that. And so among the various teams that we funded, I wanted to show you a couple of examples. And I highlight Mark Baer partly because over the years, we've funded postdocs in Mark's lab at MIT, who then went on to start their own labs, such as Emily Osterweil, who is at University of Edinburgh. And there are actually 3 or 4 researchers there at Edinburgh now. So that's become a Fragile X center. And then a postdoctoral fellow in Emily's lab is going on to her next place. So we see our funding as seed funding to spread research around the world. We fund, just like Allison was talking about, so many parallels with Allison's story. We don't choose one approach. So we're funding work all the way from gene therapy and gene reactivation to drug repurposing. So one example, Dr. Jeannie Lee at Harvard Medical School has identified a small molecule cocktail which potentially can reactivate the gene that causes Fragile X. And also she's using this approach on Rett syndrome. So this is a really exciting possibility that you could target the core defect of Fragile X, not with gene therapy, but with small molecules. We are also funding gene therapy viral vector approaches and everything in between. As Allison mentioned, there are these valleys, the valley of death in research. And so, as I mentioned, over the years, there have been different gaps. But probably the most impactful grant that we have funded and we continue to support is this FRAXA DVI down in Chile, which is a very large and sophisticated test facility using Fragile X knockout mice. And this is where potential treatments for Fragile X have been tested in a whole battery of behavioral and physiological tests in the mice. And this is part of our test bed, part of our process, so that we offer this option to many pharma companies who come to us with a potential molecule that might work in Fragile X. So pretty much all of the potential treatments that are currently active in Fragile X have been tested at FRAXA DVI. I'm just giving you a little snapshot of our drug development pipeline, which is ironic to think of our nonprofit organization as a pharma company, but in a way, that's the stage we're at. The most exciting, perhaps, or the most advanced investigational new drug that we're helping move along is a PDE4D inhibitor from Tetra Therapeutics. And FRAXA funded the initial studies at FRAXA DVI. We funded a phase 2 trial in Fragile X patients, which was quite successful. And now Tetra is taking the lead in establishing the phase 3 trial. So it's been really exciting to see that move ahead. We're also spending quite a bit of effort on repurposing available drugs, thanks to companies like Helix and Purposeful, and AI platforms that exist now. We have been able to identify many available drugs and combinations of available drugs, which are showing a lot of promise in Fragile X, including in the mice down at FRAXA DVI, and also in some cases in humans with Fragile X, because many of these are available, safe drugs that just would not have been thought of for Fragile X without this machine learning and AI technology that's available now. So there are a number of clinical trials that are starting, and we are able to fund these trials. So we're really quite excited about what's coming up. These are all pictures of Andy, who is now 32 years old, and coverage that we've been fortunate to have over the last several years, which really highlight the role that a nonprofit, parent-based foundation can have beyond the clinical, beyond recruiting patients, but in those earlier stages when you're trying to figure out what's possible. How can we design these clinical trials so that our kids can do them? IQ tests don't work with people with Fragile X. They're not motivated to do an IQ test. We need to really rethink a lot of the foundations of drug development for this kind of disorder. And there's nothing more exciting than being a part of this and being able to move the field forward. It's a little scary. It's really, when Andy was first diagnosed, I just never thought that I would have to actually do something. I thought the world was large and that other people were doing it or could do it. And the fact is that it's parents like us who know the most about these diseases. And it's no surprise. We're motivated. As Allison said, it is incredibly hard to live with a disorder like Fragile X or Angelman. So my main message to you is thank you. Thank you for trying to move us forward with these disorders. And we are here. We are motivated to help you succeed.